firm and emphatic views. The Child Poverty Reduction Bill is going to be passed soon. Its aim is to encourage a focus on child poverty reduction, the children's and facilitate political accountability. There'll be published targets, etc. The Children's Commissioner yesterday was optimistic that we can halve poverty in 10 years. Given the situation today, where we hear from the Auckland City Mission that demand for emergency food parcels is up more than a quarter and it's going to get worse, do you think we can? The Mission's Christmas drive has begun to help the 100,000 children who don't get enough good food. People have sent in interesting comments along the lines of the world was once a kinder place and we could give more easily because we knew we were giving to, and now we knew who we were giving to, and now we just give to food banks. Was the world kinder once? Is that why more children are in poverty now, do you think?
No.
We are just as kind?
I think we're just as kind, and that's definitely not the reason why more children are in poverty. There are a lot of economic reasons that we need to deal with as a nation, and also we need to have a much better benchmark and measuring system of just what poverty is, so that we can know the problem that we're addressing and we can measure improvements.
So you'd be optimistic along with the Children's Commission that we can do this? Okay.
Yeah.
Stephen?
I think you'd expect a fairly predictable response from me. I think our problems are very, very evident. We do have an awful lot more kids who are suffering, but I think it's because we've got a lot more parents who are crappy parents. And I did a blog post on my blog a week or two ago, because Jacinda Ardern was reared as a Mormon, about the extraordinary achievement in Utah. And I think there's a lot of lessons that I'd really be great if she would bring those to the fore and just ask why they have achieved so much that is so hard for us to achieve, because we've gone backwards. We were a country with a lot less of that tail a few generations ago. And I think we've subsidised poverty. We've made poverty a trap that has brought a whole lot of families in, and they know no other way of life.
It would seem, I don't know Utah, but it would seem easier to have a kind of more unified approach, presumably if you've got a whole lot of people who belong to the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, they do, although the proportion of the Utah population that's not Mormon is pretty similar to the proportions that are not Christian in other states. So I'm sure it is easier, much easier if you've got a particular brand. But that's in a way why it's such an interesting experiment, what they do, which is it's very much probably what the Salvation Army used to do, which was to demand something in return. I mean, I think it's a shame, for example, that a Prime Minister with that background has allowed Shane Jones's work for the Dole drive to disappear, so that there's even talk now of bringing in Filipinos to plant the trees that he was going to get his mokopuna off the couch to plant. Those sorts of things have just... The left should own welfare and it should reform it. And she's a very good political marketer, and she should be doing something about welfare, but they're not.
And you've had the last word. Stephen Franks on the panel today. Paula Penfold. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paula.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
Nice to see you both. We are back tomorrow. Thanks for your company, everybody. And Checkpoint is coming up.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. You're listening to Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. On tonight's programme, does a homeless man in a wheelchair with a potentially fatal medical condition living in his car qualify as a housing emergency? Not according to the Ministry of Social Development. We have details of MSD's botched handling of this case, and we'll be joined by the Minister. Fury from some red-stickered Kaikoura homeowners after learning the council wants them to move their houses a few metres along the way from a cliff rather than pay them out. And an extraordinary outburst from a minister's press secretary. Checkpoint has the tape. And new medicinal cannabis legislation passes, a historic step forward, or discrimination by stealth.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, good afternoon. Ko Katrina Bat in Aho. People are paying tribute to the slain British backpacker Grace Millane as new details emerge from the investigation into her death. The police say Ms Millane's body was intact when it was discovered in bush in the Waitakere Ranges on Sunday. They're now looking for a red shovel that could be anywhere between Scenic Drive and central Auckland. Locals have been laying flowers beneath a large painted sheet saying RIP Grace, displayed at the Titirangi roundabout. A teenager, Polly, was there to pay her respects.
It's really quite strange. Like in New Zealand, I feel like everything's quite, I don't know, peaceful, but then like you hear about something like this, and then I actually found out how many people do get murdered all the time, and it's like really horrifying, really, like it's awful.
Polly, who laid flowers at a memorial for Grace Millane. Hundreds of people are expected to gather in Queenstown tonight at a vigil for Grace. The organiser, Amanda Morris, says the ceremony will be time for the community to reflect on what has happened. Other vigils will take place tomorrow night in the main centres. The Children's Commissioner, Andrew Beecroft, says children who witness family violence suffer huge trauma, and he hopes New Zealanders aren't surprised by how widespread it is. The Justice Sector Chief Science Advisor, Dr Ian Lambie, released a new report at Parliament today, which says family violence is widespread and goes on behind closed doors in every community. Judge Beecroft says the statistics in the report are a harsh reality and nobody should be surprised.
Well, I hope we're not. I hope we realise in New Zealand that this is one of those dark and black areas of the statistics that reflect badly on New Zealand and are something of a profound national shame.
Judge Andrew Beecroft. The report comes as the government is developing a national strategy and action plan on family and sexual violence. The Ministry of Social Development has been ordered to wipe the debt of a seriously ill homeless man after insisting he pay back $10,000 for his emergency housing. The man, who has name suppression, was often wheelchair-bound and forced to sometimes live in his car because the ministry didn't think his situation was an emergency. The Social Security Appeal Authority has concluded that leaving a man with a potentially fatal condition to live in a car was incompatible with his human dignity and the values of New Zealand society. It said the man regularly pleaded for MSD's help and that he was homeless through no fault of his own, but rather due to a lack of affordable housing. The full story will be coming up on Checkpoint after this bulletin. The government's medicinal cannabis bill is about to be passed its third reading, its final hurdle in Parliament. The legislation will lay the groundwork for a medicinal cannabis industry with regulations to be in place within a year. Until a regime is set up, people who are dying will be allowed to use the drug without fear of prosecution. The National Party says the law is decriminalisation by stealth, but the Health Minister, David Clark, says it strikes the right balance.
This is the most progressive legislation that has ever been passed through this House for the supply and access to medicinal cannabis products. Madam Speaker, it's about cultivation, cannabidiol and compassion. I'm very proud to commend this bill to the House.
David Clark says officials will seek feedback on the scheme next year and will develop quality standards alongside experts. The Housing Minister is under pressure to be more upfront about the Chief Executive of the KiwiBuild unit and his employment dispute. Stephen Barclay, who heads the unit leading the flagship house building program, has been away from the job for some weeks. The Minister, Phil Twyford, will only say it's an employment dispute unrelated to either the KiwiBuild policy or program or his relationship with Mr Barclay. National's Judith Collins challenged his silence in Parliament this afternoon.
Does he believe that New Zealanders deserve to know why Mr Barclay has been away from the office and whether or not Mr Barclay is being paid?
I think New Zealanders deserve a minister that will follow the conventions of the Cabinet Manual and the provisions of the State Sector Act.
Phil Twyford responding to a question in Parliament. An inquest into the death of an Auckland man found dead inside a water drum in a Samoan prison has heard he may have been forced into it. Hans Christopher Dalton was found half submerged in the drum in his Tafa Ingata prison cell on Boxing Day in 2012. Kate White, who conducted his post-mortem, says it wasn't known how he ended up in the drum and some of his injuries were unexplained.
These and some of the other injuries are not characteristic of injury sustained in a fall or in the course of usual restraint. I can't tell you how they occurred, but I'm happy to say that I don't believe they've occurred in the course of a normal fall or stumble or in usual restraint.
Dr. White concurred with the lawyer assisting the coroner that it was more likely he had been forcibly put into the drum. A road worker has been taken to hospital with critical injuries after being hit by a car in Wellington this afternoon. The police say 2 cars crashed on Wadestown Road just after 2 o'clock and one of those cars struck the worker. One of the drivers has also been taken to hospital. It's 5 minutes past 5. Sport. The former Silver Fern Temepara Bailey is contemplating a bid to return to the New Zealand team for the World Cup. The 43-year-old has signed with the Northern Stars for next year's domestic competition, which makes her eligible to try out for the Silver Ferns. Bailey, who last played for the Silver Ferns in 2011, admits a return is not out of the question.
I'm concentrating on what's here and now. There's so many other great players around, and if it ever happens, then I'll deal with it if it does, but if it doesn't, I'm happy.
Temepara Bailey. New Zealand Rugby League appears to have dropped the ball in failing to nominate the NRL's top player, Warriors skipper Roger Tuivasa-Sheck, for the Halberg Sports Awards. Tuivasa-Sheck won the National Rugby League's prestigious Dally M Player of the Year award, the first time a Warriors player had won the prize in the club's 24-year history. Sports editor Stephen Hewson reports.
New Zealand Rugby League claims it didn't nominate Tuivasa-Sheck as he was injured and didn't play for the Kiwis in 2018. But when RNZ pointed out an athlete didn't have to be playing for a national side to be nominated, the NZRL responded that he hadn't won a World Cup or World Player of the Year award, so still didn't meet the criteria. However, the award criteria clearly states milestone events can be considered, and the NRL would certainly fall under that category, similar to motor racing driver Scott McLaughlin's nomination for winning the Australian V8 Supercars title. The Halberg Trust says nominations primarily come from national sports organisations. It had the Warriors nominated Tuivasa-Sheck. That nomination would have needed to have been endorsed by the NZRL. This is Stephen Hewson.
And that's the news.
Not enough Māori leaders in SOEs.
We've got a kaumātua to turn up for a kaikia and a cup of tea, but it's okay, you don't need to stay anymore, the job is done.
Ngāpuhi leaders urged to go.
So it needs a clean out of the leadership and a kaupapa that people can believe in.
And time for a divisive dessert.
We trot through this charade every year, like, oh, it's Christmas, oh, let's have a pavlova.
Perfect with breakfast. Morning Report with Guy and Espiner and Susie Ferguson, weekdays from 6.
Then on 9 to noon, what are the rights of the gig economy worker? And after 10, bike packer Eric Westra on restless jeans and exploring Aotearoa on 2 wheels. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight. Tomorrow, Northland, Auckland and Coromandel, cloudy periods with isolated showers. Waikato south to Manawatu and Hawke's Bay, including Bay of Plenty and Gisborne. Cloudy periods with isolated showers, more widespread and heavy inland during the afternoons and evenings, with hail and possible thunderstorms. Horowhenua to Wellington, also Wairarapa, cloudy periods, a few showers mainly tomorrow morning. Marlborough, Nelson, Bulla and Westland, mostly cloudy with scattered showers, some heavy inland with thunderstorms possible in the afternoons or evenings. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, cloudy with occasional rain becoming confined to Canterbury and North Otago tomorrow afternoon and fine spells developing elsewhere. For Fiordland, occasional rain today, fine tomorrow, apart from isolated afternoon showers. And for the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods. It's 9 minutes past 5 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thanks, Katrina, and I'm Lisa Owen. The Ministry of Social Development has been ordered to wipe the debt of a seriously ill, often wheelchair-bound beneficiary who was forced to live in his car on and off because MSD didn't think his situation was an emergency. Then when it did help him into motel accommodation, MSD insisted he pay back the $10,000 it cost, even though he had no way of ever doing so. The Social Security Appeal Authority reviewed the man's case in September 2017, but only delivered its decision last month. It concluded that leaving a man with a potentially fatal condition to live in a car was incompatible with his human dignity and the values of New Zealand society. It said the man regularly pleaded for MSD's help and that he was homeless through no fault of his own. It was due to a lack of affordable housing. The authority also said any suggestion the man could afford to pay back the special needs accommodation grant had no connection with reality. Auckland Action Against Poverty helped the man get his case reviewed. Its spokesperson, Ricardo Menendez-March, said instead of help, MSD burdened the man with debt.
We've got a man that was ill, that was facing hardship and went to work an income requiring assistance. This is somebody who was failed by the social agencies and who was desperately seeking somewhere to stay because he needed to take medication, and his medical conditions meant that his life would be at risk if he was to sleep in his car or in the streets.
And that's where he was sleeping, in his car?
Yes. So this is somebody who was sleeping in the car, and work and income, instead of providing assistance, gave him a $10,000 debt, and the assistance that they provided was intermittent. So it meant that at times he was still not able to access emergency accommodation, despite it amounting thousands of dollars worth of debt with the ministry.
So he had a medical condition, potentially life-threatening, and I understand he was sometimes using a wheelchair, is that right?
Absolutely. So this is somebody who not only had, this is somebody who had a very visible disability, a visible health condition. There was no excuse for the case managers to not have picked up that this is a man who clearly had specific needs, somebody who was not, nobody should be sleeping in their cars or in the street, but this is somebody who particularly needed somewhere warm and dry to spend his nights.
Did you consider him to be in an emergency situation?
Absolutely.
Because MSD says he wasn't. Well, initially said he wasn't.
Exactly. And this is a fight that advocates have to take up day and day again, where MSD and Work and Income will not treat clearly emergency situations as such, and people will have to beg for assistance just to be turned down, or if the assistance is provided, like in this case, it'll be slapped with a debt.
So, in brief, how would you describe the way he was treated?
Completely unacceptable, callous and cruel. This is a complete failure by MSD to provide the assistance they're supposed to provide. And this is not historic, this is ongoing. This is something that is still happening despite a change of government. We've still got people that are faced with recoverable advances instead of just straight up assistance because they're homeless.
Well, here's the thing. The Ministry of Social Development says the rules have changed. They're applied differently now. This is something, in essence, that is in the past. They say these days most grants for emergency accommodation don't have to be paid back.
It is true that there's been a reduction in the recoverable grants, but it still amounts to about 10% of them. We're talking about 3,000 people in a period of 3 months that required emergency housing this year. So what this is we've got hundreds of people who would have been slapped with a debt still, and some of the reasons are really arbitrary, such as failing to look for alternative private accommodation. People who can never afford a private rental.
Yeah,
and
but
despite that,
the ministry, sorry to interrupt, but the ministry also says it's because some of them have clearly been bad tenants. They may have wrecked properties. They may have been kicked out through their own fault and misbehaviour. So should they have their debts cleared?
Absolutely. Well, the problem with emergency housing is that people living there have no rights as tenants. A motel could arbitrarily kick them out without a person having a right of reply, as you would if you were living in a private rental. The problem is that if you're facing discrimination from a motelier, they could kick you out just because they don't like you. They could blame you for bad behavior, and there is no process where you could defend yourself against the motelier who simply wants to make a profit and wants to have, tenants or people staying there who have more money.
Do you think there are wider implications from this decision?
This decision has political implications. What this tells me is that the way that the Ministry of Social Development has been handling emergency accommodation is wrong. And they should be going back, looking at each individual case where the emergency accommodation grant was made recoverable, and it should be investigated. At the very least, I would expect the ministry to wipe the debt of all the people who had been in an emergency situation and were given a recoverable advance.
So, a loan, in essence, they were given. You think it's the ministry's responsibility to proactively review all of these cases?
Absolutely, or at least do a blanket, wiping off the debt. I think it will take a lot of resources to wipe the debt altogether, but I think this is something that has deep and long-term impacts on beneficiaries. These people are carrying a debt, some of them for the rest of their life, and it affects their finances. They're having to pay $20 each week at a time where they already are struggling to pay for food. We just saw a report about how many families are struggling to even cover the basic costs, and the debt that they're carrying is going to make them struggle even more to afford basic goods.
Is this man owed an apology?
This man is owed an apology, but it's not just him. It's actually the hundreds or thousands of people that continue to be put in this situation. So the ministry cannot simply apologise to one man and continue doing the same things to many other people in the future.
That is Ricardo Menendez-March from Auckland Action Against Poverty. Now, the Minister for Social Development, Carmel Sepuloni, also agrees that the ministry should apologise to the man. She told me that under her watch, MSD has more empathy, but the onus is still on beneficiaries to appeal what could be unfair decisions that burden them with debt.
I think that it was unacceptable.
Why?
It's unacceptable because to state that his situation was not an emergency situation is, in my mind, from what I've seen, incorrect. And the emergency housing assistance, in my mind, that he received shouldn't have been made recoverable. It should have been non-recoverable. And I think, you know, where people think that they have a case like that where a determination by MSD they think was wrong, then they need to be going through the review process to check whether or not that is the case.
Should they have to battle like that, though, to get what they're entitled to?
No, they shouldn't. And that's why a big part of this year for me as well has been concentrated on changing the service culture and delivery at MSD. And I think we've seen some of those changes come about with things like, you know, more people getting access to the supports they need. There have been decreases in the number of people that have been suspended, had their benefits suspended or cancelled, increases in the numbers of hardship grants that have been given out or approved or accepted. And so I would hope, too, that with cases like this, where someone presents with serious need, that the treatment that they're receiving from MSD now is much more empathetic and compassionate compared to what they would have received under the previous government.
Do you think that this client is owed an apology from MSD?
I think so.
Are you going to tell them that?
Well, look, you know, I've only been presented with this case this afternoon, but it'll be definitely something that I talk with my officials about.
What do you think the wider implications of this case are? Because the decision made it very clear that this man did not contribute in any way to his homelessness. In fact, they say that it was because there was a lack of available housing at an affordable price. Could it be that there are other cases where people should have their debt waived because they have similar circumstances?
Look, if people think that they have a case in terms of whatever ruling was made to them and they feel like it was not befitting with the policy of the time, then they should definitely take up a case. I would encourage people to do that if they think that the ruling that was made against them was incorrect. And, you know, with regards to this case, I think I've only just been informed of this particular one, but I'll be speaking about this with officials. And, yeah, this does, in my mindset, put out their questions, and I think our officials need to be taking that into consideration with regards to if there are other cases that come up along these lines where a person has been made to pay back a debt despite the fact that it was not their fault and there was an incorrect ruling or judgment made at the time, then MSD needs to be open to responding to that.
And that's the Social Development Minister, Carmel Sepuloni. As she mentioned there, this case was heard under the previous government in 2017, but the decision was only delivered in the last couple of weeks. We will talk to the Deputy CEO of MSD, Viv Rickard, after 6, and we'd also love your feedback on this issue. You can text us on 2101, you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, Facebook us, Checkpoint, or email checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. Police investigating the murder of British backpacker Grace Millane are asking for help locating a shovel believed to be related to their inquiry. They want anyone who might have found a red Atlas trade hardwood shovel or taken it home over the past week to get in touch as they wrapped up their scene investigation in the Waitakere Ranges. Police believe Ms Millane was murdered between December 1st and 2nd before her body was dumped on Scenic Drive. Katie Doyle reports from West Auckland.
West Aucklanders continued to come out in their droves today, paying respects to murdered tourist Grace Mullane. It's a community in shock, with many locals still reeling over what's happened.
It shouldn't be like this. This is a beautiful country. We feel sad, and why that happened like this?
Yeah, a little bit sad, yeah. And I hope her family is okay.
We thought, well, we must come pay our respects, because we're very upset that this has happened in our country.
The roadside where Ms Mullane's body was found is now adorned with flowers and messages. Some spoke of their grief over the loss, while others wished for swift justice against the accused, who appeared in the Auckland District Court yesterday. Initially, the judge denied the 26-year-old's request for name suppression, but the man appealed, meaning he must remain anonymous for at least 20 days. But international media and people on social media have continued to flout these rules, publishing his name and photograph. The Justice Minister, Andrew Little, says the international media are undermining the judicial process by publishing suppressed details. Mr Little says it's one thing for an innocent person to go to trial, but it's equally unjust if a guilty person walks free because the justice system has failed.
The international media, particularly the British media, are not helping the Mullane family, and if the British media are concerned about justice and doing justice for the Mullane family, they should stop publishing details.
Mr Little says the overseas media's actions are hurtful towards the Mullane family, when the Defence Counsel is looking for every opportunity to force a mistrial. The lawyer for the accused has declined to comment. But this morning, police posted a tweet reminding people that it is an offence to breach a court order such as name suppression, including on social media. Today, as they concluded their investigation in Scenic Drive, police appealed to the public for the whereabouts of an Atlas Trade hardwood shovel with a red mouth that they say is related to their investigation. Police say this may have been seen or taken from the central city or the Waitakere Ranges over the past week. Meanwhile, at least 10 candlelit vigils are planned across the country. Tonight, hundreds are expected to gather in Queenstown, but most vigils will take place from 7 o'clock tomorrow night across the country. The Queenstown organiser, Amanda Morris, says the vigil will be time for the community to reflect on what has happened.
I think around 500 are looking to turn up because the majority of Queenstown is backpackers. I think it'll just be more to share their respects because it'll have affected everybody in some sort of way, as well as people from New Zealand, to just all come together.
Many have extended the vigil to include all women killed by men in New Zealand this year. I Tamaki Makaurau, mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Katie Doyle, tēnei.
And after 6 o'clock tonight, we'll go live to our reporter Sarah Robson, who is at the Queenstown Vigil. A historic step forward or decriminalisation by stealth. Legislation making medicinal cannabis more widely available has just passed its final reading in Parliament. Our political reporter Craig McCulloch wraps up the reaction.
For Rebecca Ryder, today is a complicated one.
It's a real mixed cocktail of feelings rather than pure joy, but the fact that we've gotten to this point is amazing.
Ms Ryder uses cannabis to treat her chronic pain and has fought for New Zealanders' right to do so. Today's legislation paves the way for a medicinal cannabis industry, with regulations to be set up within a year. It also introduces an amnesty, which means till a regime is in place, people who are dying will be able to use the drug without fear of prosecution. But people like Ms Ryder will remain criminals.
Oh yeah, I'm about to go check in my backpack at the Parliament security, hoping they don't look into it, I'll put it that way. Can't wait till the day when I don't have to worry about that.
Today is not that day. The Drug Foundation's head, Ross Bell, says the law is a huge step forward and calls for celebration. But he too is disappointed it doesn't go further and doesn't cover more people, including those who provide the drug.
Many hundreds of patients told their stories of real hurt and shame and difficulties of accessing product. They told those stories and were completely ignored by the Select Committee. And then I think the galling thing for me was seeing the debate in the House where members of Parliament were saying, we heard, we were so moved by these patients' stories. And I was screaming at Parliament TV saying, well, you were so moved that you ignored all these people.
This is the most progressive legislation that has ever been passed through this House for the supply and access to medicinal cannabis products. Madam Speaker, it's about cultivation, cannabidiol and compassion. I'm very proud to commend this bill to the House.
The Health Minister David Clark has touted the bill as striking the right balance. Officials will seek feedback on how the scheme should operate next year and will develop the quality standards alongside experts. But the opposition is not on board.
Shame on the House for passing this terrible, unsafe, dangerous bill.
Nationals leader Simon Bridges says his party supports medicinal cannabis, but not this law. In fact, he calls it decriminalisation of cannabis by stealth.
What will the police do when they're outside of school and someone under this bill is smoking cannabis? What will they do? I don't reckon they'll do much at all, actually, because today that's what this Parliament arguably has lazily, has irresponsibly done in this House.
The tenor of the debate gives a preview of a larger showdown brewing. The government's promised a referendum on the legalisation of cannabis before or at the next election, and campaigners like Rebecca Ryder are now turning their sights there.
We hope things can be sorted out with the referendum, honestly. That's where we're looking next. Just keep fighting and speaking up, telling our stories.
From Parliament for Checkpoint, Craig McCulloch.
Let us know what you think about that story. You can text us on 2101. Is it going far enough or too far? Well, some red-stickered Kaikoura homeowners are furious after learning the council wants to move their houses just a few metres forward away from a dangerous cliff rather than pay them out. During the 2016 Kaikoura earthquake, massive boulders pummeled the small township of Rakatara and the council red-stickered 5 homes and batches there, which have remained in place ever since. But after months of delays, the cash-strapped council has finally decided what it will do. And as Logan Church reports, landowners are not happy.
For more than 2 years now, 5 Rakotara property owners have been waiting. Jo Davidson is one of them. Her father lived in Rakotara before he died. His former home and her family's former holiday home has sat pretty much untouched since the quake, as the council slapped a red sticker on the property. To get that sticker off, the council has decided, after months of geo reports and discussion, to move the home on the property away from the neighbouring cliff. And Jo's not impressed.
Their grand plan is to move our properties forward closer to the railway line, which would reduce the risk of damage in an earthquake. So obviously that has met with great disgust by all of us.
At a meeting in September between the 5 Rakotara residents with red-stickered properties, all 5 made it very clear they did not want to live there again.
Everybody there said they had no appetite for going back to living there. They were in fear of their life. We had people who were there during the earthquake who thought they were going to die. They are not going back there. So that was made very, very clear. They obviously didn't listen to that.
There are 15 properties in the Kaikoura district affected by land hazards. The council has come up with different options for all of them. For example, the council believes 2 properties are now safe to occupy. However, 2 others are not, and the council has offered financial assistance to help them retreat. One of those belonged to Sam and Emmy Coleri from Ocean View Motel. We've met them before on Checkpoint, and they told us today they don't really know what the council's decision means, and they're nervously waiting for more information. The decision on what to do for all properties was made in secret by the council last month. Its chief executive, Angela Oosthuizen, has been leading the council's work on this. She says she understands some landowners, especially those in Rakotara, might be frustrated by the council's decision.
We do understand how the ratepayers feel. We know that they don't feel safe going back. We've taken into account what the residents have said. We've also taken into account what our geotechnical experts have advised us. And based on that, we've looked at that and believe that the risk can be reduced to a tolerable level.
The government's given $1.5 million to the council to solve this problem for all 15 properties. The local government minister, Nanai Mahuta, agreed to an interview today after refusing numerous requests from Checkpoint to talk about this. Residents have accused the government of being stingy with its contribution.
Look, we've worked with the Kaikoura District Council to address some issues that they're confronting as a result of the effect of the earthquake there. This has been a long process. In relation to the properties, what we've done is work with the council to find a solution where we were assessing risk to life and then ensuring an approach that was a lot more sustainable. So we believe we've worked constructively with the council, and we've gotten to an outcome that, in terms of risk to life, we've assessed the most serious needs to address first.
This issue has obviously had a massive impact on the lives of the people involved. Because of this, I've put in several requests to your office for interviews this year. Your PR person has told me that this has not been a matter of urgency for you. Why has this not been a matter of urgency for you?
Oh, look, I can't answer for whoever you've been talking to. I've been presented with this opportunity to have a conversation, of which I'm doing so right now.
But I've been asking for months and months and months for this.
I'm not sure if you have been asking for months and months and months, but I've got Chris sitting here right next to me. I'm sure you can take that up with him.
But the press secretary decided to take it up with us while we were still recording. Anything else you would like to add?
Oh, look, anything in terms of formal requests you will have to take up with Chris. I'm not sure where that was at.
Oh,
There he is.
That's fine. Hey, no, really appreciate your time. You have a good one. Oh, hello, Chris. How are you going?
Yes, that's right. Logan, you realise that you didn't get the interview before because the local council hadn't reported back.
Well, Chris, I've asked for interviews before, and you've said you've put my request to the minister. And she just told me now that you hadn't actually put those on.
What? Oh, of course we did. But the fact is that we just didn't. It was a simple matter that until the local council reported, that we weren't going to talk about it.
Well, that's fine, Chris, but you've said before to me that you had put my request to the minister, and she just told me now that you hadn't.
Well, we did, but I mean that's neither here nor there.
Well, it is, Chris, because it's two different stories.
Oh, all right. Look, if you want to throw me to the wolves, you just go and do it, but don't expect any help in the future.
Well, Chris, I'm not trying to throw you to the... Meanwhile, the council's chief executive, Angela Oosthuizen, says the council is grateful for the Crown contribution.
You have to look at the whole funding assistance in context. There's been a huge amount of help, financial help that's been provided to Kaikoura. We're not just looking at the residents, but we're looking at all the other help, in terms of road restoration, rail restoration, the three waters, the roads and the bridges. So when you add that all up, we're talking about a substantial amount that the Crown has actually, provided to Kaikoura.
Angela would not go into details yet as to how the $1.5 million will be spent, but she says an implementation plan will be put together in the new year. But for these Kaikoura landowners, it's now a further wait, and a growing sense of unease.
We have made it very clear that we would not go there, we would not take family there, we would not take friends there, we certainly wouldn't take our grandchildren there, and we would even not want to sell it on to someone else knowing that there's a risk.
So for now, the wait continues.
Logan Church reporting there. Coming up, Canterbury Regional Council stands by its decision to allow 2 bottling companies to export water. Meanwhile, Napier residents are told their brown, silty water is perfectly safe to drink. National demands more answers about why the head of the KiwiBuild agency has been off the job for weeks. And we go live to Queenstown to the vigil for slain British backpacker Grace Millane. But first, here's Katrina Batten with the headlines.
The police have revealed Grace Millane's body was intact when it was discovered in bush at the Waitakere Ranges on Sunday. They're now looking for a red shovel that could be anywhere between Scenic Drive and Central Auckland. Meanwhile, locals have been laying flowers in Titirangi near where Ms Millane's body was found. Tonight, hundreds of people are expected to gather in Queenstown at a vigil for the British backpacker. A new family violence investigation reveals it happens behind closed doors in every neighbourhood, including in high-income households where 1 in every 4 women experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. Last year, the police investigated more than 120,000 family harm cases. That's 1 every 4 minutes. The Ministry of Social Development has been ordered to wipe the debt of a seriously ill homeless man after insisting he pay back $10,000 for his emergency housing. The man in a wheelchair who has name suppression was forced to sometimes live in his car because the ministry didn't think his situation was an emergency. The Social Security Appeal Authority has concluded that leaving a man with a potentially fatal condition to live in a car was incompatible with his human dignity and the values of New Zealand society. The National Party is labelling the government's medicinal cannabis bill decriminalisation by stealth. The legislation, which lays the groundwork for a medicinal cannabis industry, has passed its final reading in Parliament this afternoon. It also allows people who are dying to use the drug without fear of prosecution until the scheme is set up. Nationals leader Simon Bridges says the party supports medicinal cannabis, but not smoking the drug in public. The Housing Minister is under pressure to be more upfront about the Chief Executive of the KiwiBuild unit and his employment dispute. Stephen Barclay, who heads the unit leading the flagship house building program, has been away from the job for some weeks. The Minister, Phil Twyford, will only say it's an employment dispute unrelated to either the KiwiBuild policy or program and his relationship with Mr Barclay. Those are the headlines. I'm back at 6.
Thanks, Katrina. I hear a bell tolling. Is it for Nona Peltier or a new takeaway joint?
Could be a new takeaway joint, indeed. Yes, Restaurant Brands, which is a retail restaurant company, they have a number of brands. One of them is, of course, KFC. The other is Carl Jr., and they also have Pizza Hut. They had Starbucks until recently. They sold the license for that, the franchise license, and so they are now going to bring Taco Bell to New Zealand and Australia. They've already been operating Taco Bell in Hawaii, so they have some experience with the brand. They're planning to open 60 stores in New Zealand and Australia.
That's a lot, isn't it?
Yes, it is, over the next 5 years. First one being in Auckland in 2019. And of course, it's not without risk. I mean, when you're going to make that kind of expansion, that's huge. Investors, though, have been waiting for years for this. The annual meetings every year, they get that question, when are they bringing Taco Bell to New Zealand? It's seen as a way of really making a lot of profits, a popular brand.
For people who don't know it, it's basically fast
food, tacos.
Mexican
tacos, yeah, in all kinds of shapes and sizes, and you get them for breakfast and for lunch and for dinner and what have you.
Tacos 100 ways.
That's right, and it's been around for at least 40 some years, so, you know, it's an old brand. And in North America, you'll often see them combined with KFC. They're in the same store, so it's quite an interesting
Is there any
mix.
suggestion that they're going to carry that model?
Well, there was an interview with Russell Creedy, who is the chief executive of Restaurant Brand, earlier today, and he was saying, you know, it's the kind of thing that can be easily scaled up, so they can have, you know, a full restaurant, they can have a small takeaway outfit. They don't need a big kitchen. It doesn't require a lot of skill to make a taco, so you don't have to have a, you know, master chef in there.
Some would beg to differ.
Well, some might differ, but basically it's fairly inexpensive fast food. It's quick you know, turnover rather. And yeah, so you would expect this to do well. They've done well with this product in Hawaii, so potentially they could do well in New Zealand and Australia. Separately, the company also, the directors of the company have also suggested that they're positive about a potential, like a partial takeover of the company. Another Mexican company, separately to Taco Bell, is offering to take a 75% stake in the company. I think they're offering $9.45 a share. And so today in the market, the share price rose 2.5%, 21 cents up to $8.50. So there's still some upside there. They're saying go ahead and accept it. Others are saying maybe you should just wait. The offer is open till March, so take your time.
Okay. And new data on our spending. Are we out thrashing the cards, are we?
We are thrashing the cards. Now, interestingly, the amount of spending fell last month, which is interesting, and that's seasonally adjusted drop 0.4%. Now, that's because of fuel. So we were spending less money on that. But we were spending a lot more on department stores, restaurants, and bars. So that should be good for retailers. Yes, and so that was what we were up overall. If you excluded the fuel-related sales, we were up 0.5%. So that's not too bad, and that's given the retailer some reason for some kind of, hope for because we've had a really tough year for retailers. There's no question about it. So this will be good. This is a make or break for them Christmas season. So overall, our markets, we managed an 11-point rise today, which is pretty good because it's not very nice out there. Real volatility, lots of worry and global risk. So we finished at 8,671. And on the currency markets, overnight we hit a new high, a high against the British pence, which really took a dive to 55 pence. We were at a 15-month high there. So we finished at 68.8 US cents, 95.5 Australian, and 54.7 pence. And there's a lot of volatility there with Brexit, a lot of uncertainty on global trade. So anything can happen overnight. Who can predict?
Thank you, Nona. Nona Peltier with your business update there. We're off to the South Island now. Canterbury Regional Council is standing by its decision to allow 2 bottling companies to export water. This is despite a case going against it at the High Court in Christchurch today. The court has ruled that the process followed by the council was wrong and will next year consider whether their resource consents were granted illegally. Katie Todd reports.
Cloud Ocean Water and Rapaki Natural Resources have both set up operations in the Christchurch suburb of Belfast. Cloud Ocean took over an old wool scour, while Rapaki Natural Resources set up at an old freezing works. The Canterbury Regional Council then transferred the consents that came with the properties to take water from the aquifers to the companies. Campaign group Aotearoa Water Action says that was wrong and asked for a judicial review. Here is its spokesperson, Peter Richardson.
Water bottling is an activity that has completely different effects to the operation of a wool scour and the operation of a freezing works in terms of the way water is used.
The High Court today ruled in favour of Aotearoa Water Action, concluding that the old industrial consents could not be relied on to carry on water bottling. The decision does not mean that the water bottling consents are cancelled, but Mr Richardson says it paves the way for a hearing on that issue in the new year.
We were delighted, of course, but I've got to say not surprised. We thought the hearing went well. Our barrister did a fantastic job, Prue Stephen, really thrilled with the work that she did, and we were confident that we would succeed.
Canterbury Regional Council says it stands by its decision to transfer the existing industrial resource consents. Spokesperson Catherine Shackey says the ruling relates to a minor point of law and they won't know the true implications of the court proceeding until the second hearing on the matter next year.
We have absolute confidence that the way we processed these consents was appropriate and our decision to grant the consents was in accordance with the law, and we have every confidence that that's the decision that the court will reach as well.
For now, both companies are able to continue taking water. A spokesperson for Cloud Ocean Water says the company has since obtained a new consent expressly for water bottling. They say Cloud Ocean Water has invested nearly $60 million in the plant, creating 200 jobs in Belfast. But Peter Richardson says the High Court decision is significant, given the number of sites and resource consents around New Zealand that bottling companies could take advantage of.
It's important because there are a whole lot of old industrial consents sitting out there, which are basically unutilised or completely underutilised. If those consents were able to be automatically converted to water bottling use, then the holders of those consents would be able to increase or would increase substantially the amount actually taken in terms of the consents and would put aquifers and particularly community water supplies at risk.
Yesterday's decision comes days before a commissioner is due to decide if another request from Cloud Ocean Water to take water from a second deeper bore should be publicly notified. Kei Ototahi aho, mō te hōtaka o te Atenei, ko Katie Todd tēnei.
It's about 17 minutes away from 6. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. 1 in 4 women from high-income households suffer physical or sexual violence in their lifetime, according to a new report which has confirmed family violence happens in all suburbs. The police investigated more than 120,000 family harm incidents in 2017. That's about 1 every 4 minutes. The report comes after the killing of 2 women in Auckland in recent weeks. The report's author says the solution is to target family violence from the moment a child is born to try and stop it. Our political reporter Jo Moyer was at the launch of the report.
The focus on physical and sexual violence comes after a 34-year-old woman's death in the Auckland suburb of Flatbush last night. A 34-year-old man who was known to her has been charged with murder over her death. And it's only days since 22-year-old British backpacker Grace Mullane's body was found, sparking an outpouring of grief and shame that it could happen in New Zealand. The Undersecretary for Justice, Jan Logie, says clearly it's provoked a national conversation. She challenged people to consider putting faces to violence so it is personal and every death receives the same attention and treatment Miss Mullanes has.
If people are connecting to this story, to actually hold that as a driver for us to do better by everyone in our society.
The discussion paper released today says family violence is widespread in New Zealand and goes on behind closed doors in all communities. 1 in 10 men have experienced childhood sexual abuse and 1 in 3 women experience physical or sexual abuse from an intimate partner in their lifetime. Dr Lambie says victims are in everyone's neighbourhoods and even extended family, so it needs to be treated as personal. He says the current statistics are an underestimation because only a tiny proportion of family violence is reported, but that could change with new approaches.
When you go and interview people in their homes, you have conversations with them in their homes, I think you hear different stories, you hear real stories as opposed to more sort of higher survey data.
The report notes high rates of family violence in Māori and Pacific communities can be a result of generational cycles, but it's not impossible to break them. However, Dr Lambie says he's not the right person to delve into the cultural approaches needed to tackle violence within Māori and Pacifica families.
I was very aware that I'm a Pākehā New Zealander, and really I think I need to leave that up to Māori who work in this field, that have the expertise, and that is more appropriate than myself commenting on what Māori should do.
The Children's Commissioner Andrew Beecroft says children who witness family violence suffer huge trauma, and he hopes New Zealanders aren't surprised by how widespread it is.
Well, I hope we're not. I hope we realise in New Zealand that this is one of those dark and black areas of the statistics that reflect badly on New Zealand and are something of a profound national shame.
Judge Beecroft says the statistics in the report released today are a harsh reality of New Zealand and not something to be proud of. The report comes as the government is developing a national strategy and action plan on family violence and sexual violence, which Ms Logie says she hopes to see funding for in next year's budget. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Jo Moya.
A pathologist has told the coroner it's possible an Auckland man found dead in a water drum in a Samoan prison was forcefully put there. Hans Christopher Dalton was found half submerged in a 44-gallon drum of water in his Tawhainata prison cell on Boxing Day in 2012. 6 years later, an inquest is being held in Auckland to determine the facts of his death. Our court reporter Annika Smith was there.
Hans Dalton had been on holiday with his family in Samoa when they were caught in Cyclone Evan. He had been a psychiatric patient but lost his medication in the natural disaster before having an episode. Officials put the 38-year-old in a prison cell for his own safety, but he was found dead the following morning. Samoan authorities charged another inmate with murder, but he was later cleared. Since then, they've provided little information about Mr Dalton's death. Sergeant Heather Riddell of the New Zealand Police told the court that authorities here had no control over that.
We have no legal jurisdiction with Samoa, however we do have the ability to liaise, and I made inquiries and received, similar to the coroner, no response. I went through Interpol and also went through Mr Udu and another officer and could not get any information.
Coroner Ryan said all that had materialised from repeated attempts to retrieve reports over the past 6 years was a document on an inquiry into the prison. Its findings were critical about how the prison was run and the care it provided. The coroner acknowledged there was little reliable information about what happened to Mr Dalton, but said the inquest would still proceed. This morning the court heard from Dr Kate White, the pathologist who flew to Samoa to conduct a post-mortem before Mr Dalton was repatriated. Describing his injuries, she noted bruises and abrasions on his face, abdomen and back, some of which couldn't be explained.
These and some of the other injuries are not characteristic of injuries sustained in a fall or in the course of usual restraint. I can't tell you how they occurred, but I'm happy to say that I don't believe they've occurred in the course of a normal fall or stumble or unusual restraint.
She found his cause of death to be drowning, and she also found Mr Dalton had a heart condition, which would have made him more susceptible to drowning.
My personal preference is to think that he has drowned and his coronary artery disease has potentially contributed to that. He may have died earlier in his drowning sequence because of his coronary artery disease.
But Dr. White said it was unclear how he ended up in the water drum. She concurred with Christopher Gudsell QC, the lawyer assisting the coroner, that it was more likely he had been forcibly put in the drum. The inquest, which will hear from Mr. Dalton's mother and medical professionals who treated him, is set down for 3 days. For Checkpoint, this is Annika Smith.
The National Party is demanding more answers about why the head of KiwiBuild has been away from the job for weeks as a result of an employment dispute. Stephen Barclay was appointed in May to lead the flagship program, which aims to build 100,000 houses in 10 years. But trouble has hit just months later. The Housing Minister, Phil Twyford, has listed a number of things the dispute is not linked to, but still refuses to discuss what exactly has happened. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
No one is talking about exactly what is happening with the head of the KiwiBuild unit, except to say it's an employment dispute unrelated to either the KiwiBuild policy or program. Phil Twyford told reporters he's been given regular high-level briefings, but won't discuss details.
I was first briefed on October the 31st that there were matters that the Chief Executive of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development was looking into. I was told at that point that it would be better if I wasn't briefed on any of the details about that, and I took that advice and I am holding to that.
Mr Twyford says the government's home building program is ticking along regardless, but clearly he would have preferred the employment dispute hadn't happened in the first place.
It's certainly an unwelcome distraction, and I'm as focused as I can be on ensuring that as a government we're implementing this policy and we're building houses.
There have also been problems at the New Zealand Transport Agency, with the resignation of Chief Executive Fergus Gammie following ongoing pressure about the agency's ability to enforce road safety regulations. Nationals leader Simon Bridges says trouble with 2 chief executives within Mr Twyford's portfolio responsibilities does raise questions.
What it shows is behind the scenes in both of these entities, they're core infrastructure entities for the government, the level of dysfunction you've got actually. You've got a situation in KiwiBuild where we're seeing every day the shambolic nature of it, and that's led to a breakdown in the relationship. You're also seeing the same in NZTA. Look, I know that entity incredibly well. Fergus Gammie was a first-class chief executive.
He says the minister should be more transparent about what's happening with the KiwiBuild chief executive.
You find examples littered throughout the recent past where ministers have chosen to speak on some of these things and other times they didn't. So I think that's all very convenient, frankly too convenient.
Mr Twyford did give some detail in Parliament about what the dispute was not related to.
Mr Barclay's employment matter has nothing to do with his relationship with me or my office. It has nothing to do with the establishment of the new Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, and it has nothing to do with the merits of the KiwiBuild policy.
National's Judith Collins challenged the minister on his silence.
Does he believe that New Zealanders deserve to know why Mr Barclay has been away from the office and whether or not Mr Barclay is being paid?
I think New Zealanders deserve a minister that will follow the conventions of the Cabinet Manual and the provisions of the State Sector Act, not wading into an employment dispute. I would have thought the member, who's a former lawyer and a minister, would understand that.
Phil Twyford says he doesn't know how long the situation will take to resolve or how much it's costing taxpayers with Stephen Barclay away on leave. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Jane Patterson.
The Independent Police Conduct Authority has slated a former officer who damaged an investigation into a teacher's relationship with a 13-year-old girl and misled the teacher's disciplinary tribunal. The detective sergeant was the chair of the Board of Trustees of Gisborne Intermediate, where the teacher, Samuel Back, worked. He was also the direct supervisor of the officer who investigated Mr Back in 2014 over allegations he was in an inappropriate relationship with Reha McClelland, who was a former student and who died later the same year. Our education correspondent John Gerritsen reports.
Police did not lay charges against Mr Back, but in 2016 the Teachers Disciplinary Tribunal cancelled the then 42-year-old's registration for serious misconduct. He had an intense relationship with Reha McClelland, arranging to meet her when his wife was absent and telling her he wanted to climb in her window. Now the Independent Police Conduct Authority says the police investigation in 2014 had multiple deficiencies. Warren Young from the authority says evidence was not properly recorded and analysed, and the investigation was concluded prematurely. He says much of the blame lies with the then head of the local child protection team.
A major failing in this case was that the supervisor had a conflict of interest because he was chair of the Board of Trustees at the school. He did not supervise properly as a result of that, but he took no steps to arrange an alternative supervisor.
Dr Young says it's unlikely a better investigation would have found more evidence or that it would have avoided Reha's death. He says 2 years later the detective sergeant used his police email to write to the Teachers Disciplinary Tribunal in his capacity as board chair at Gisborne Intermediate to support Mr Back's request for name suppression.
He did so using as support the fact that the investigation was ongoing when he knew that it was not ongoing and had been concluded. He therefore not only presented himself as a police officer and had a conflict of interest in doing so, but he misled the council.
Dr Young says that was misconduct at the serious end of the spectrum and a foolish attempt to protect the school rather than a deliberate attempt to pervert the course of justice. Gisborne Intermediate today confirmed the man is still the chairperson of its board but is now stepping down. The Police Eastern District Commander, Tanya Kura, says police were in an employment process with the officer until early last year.
That officer actually no longer works for us, and he made a decision to leave, and the employment process was discontinued. And I'm not really in a position to comment on the employment process as such. That's between the employer and the employee.
Superintendent Kura says the police now have conflict of interest training to avoid such situations. Meanwhile, the lawyer for Reha's family, Moira McNabb, says they're exhausted after seeing so many investigations of their daughter's case.
They've done it to try and improve things for others, and they're an amazing family, very loving family, highly intelligent family, and if you met them you'd say anybody, this could happen to anyone. You know, they need to be really celebrated for their staunchness, their caring towards other people. They're not doing this to get back at people, they're doing it for positive change, and that's something that's very positive.
Moira McNabb says the family hopes to meet with police next year to discuss changes they have made. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi, ko John Gerritsen tēnei.
Napier residents are being told the brown, silty water coming out of their taps is perfectly safe to drink. But many are venting their frustration on social media at the lack of action being taken to fix the problem that some say have plagued them for almost a year, for the most part of a year. Our Hawke's Bay reporter Anusha Bradley has the story.
On Sunday night, 76-year-old Tamatea resident Selwyn Hawthorne was looking forward to a hot bath.
I turned the bath on and went out of the bathroom and came back, well, I don't know, half a minute later perhaps, and the water was an appalling colour.
The water was brown, thick with sediment, and not just in Selwyn's house. Residents in the suburbs of Onekawa, Tamatea, Greenmeadows and Piramai took to social media over the weekend to vent their frustration at the dirty water. Napier City Council says it received 125 complaints. It's not the first time it's happened. Some residents say it's been happening on and off since March when the council started chlorinating the water. The council's chief executive Wayne Jack says work to install a new pump in Onekawa over the weekend, which will increase flows during the summer months, ended up affecting a much wider area than anticipated.
Unfortunately, what it does is it puts a lot more pressure through the pipe network, through our water network, and what it does is it changes the direction of the flow from what has been going, and so then it just loosens off any sediment which are in the pipes.
But he says the brown water is perfectly safe to drink.
As much as it doesn't look great, yes, it is safe. The water has been tested. It's not a harmful bacteria which is in the water.
Selwyn Hawthorne says he won't be drinking it.
I ran a laboratory for a very large meat company in Hawke's Bay, and part of my process was to maintain potable water to meet USDA and EU compliance. I know a lot about water and I would not drink this rubbish.
Wayne Jack says now the pump's been installed, it shouldn't happen again, but the council does plan to clean out many of the city's old pipes in the future, which may cause more sediment to be stirred up. The owner of Aquafilter Hawke's Bay, Brian Carwood, says the dirty water always results in a spike in inquiries, but with filters costing between $200,000 and $10,000, the cost puts many people off. He says the introduction of chlorine can often increase sediment and discoloration in water.
You've got a situation where council is caught between a rock and a hard place, and they're not in a position not to chlorinate because, I mean, there's a liability issue there. You know, there's no council that's going to stop chlorination until they find a viable alternative.
An online petition calling for the council to sort out the issue once and for all has gathered more than 700 signatures since Sunday. The council says it will consider bringing forward a program of work to clean water pipes sooner, as well as looking at how it could better manage and operate its water network. In Napier for Checkpoint, Anusha Bradley.
And if you're just listening to Anusha Bradley's report, you should go online. It'll be on our Facebook page or our website. There are some amazing pictures there. You could, I don't know, I think you could build a sandcastle with the silt that was in the bottom of that bathtub. Let us know what you think. 2101, text us. And very briefly, some other feedback from you. This is with regards to the story about MSD having to wipe the debt of a beneficiary who was living in a car, struggling to find accommodation. Simon from Wellington says, how can work and income recover debt by subtracting funds from the minimum required to survive? There must be a floor beneath which recovery is illegal, he says. This other texter says the debt should be recovered from the salary of the relevant case manager. We'll have more on that story after 6.
RNZ News at 6. Kia ora, good evening. Ko Katrina Batanaho. The Ministry of Social Development has been ordered to wipe the debt of a seriously ill beneficiary who was occasionally homeless. The Social Security Appeal Authority reviewed the man's case in September 2017, but only delivered its decision last month. It concluded that leaving a man with a potentially fatal condition to live in a car was incompatible with his human dignity and the values of New Zealand society. When it helped the man into a motel, the ministry insisted he repay $10,000 for the cost. Auckland Action Against Poverty helped the man get his case reviewed. Its spokesperson Ricardo Menendez-March told Checkpoint instead of helping, the ministry burdened the man with debt.
So this is somebody who was sleeping in the car, and Work and Income, instead of providing assistance, gave him a $10,000 debt, and the assistance that they provided was intermittent. So it meant that at times he was still not able to access emergency accommodation.
Ricardo Menendez-March. The Minister for Social Development, Carmel Sepuloni, says the ministry should apologise to the man. The Health Minister, David Clark, has hailed the government's medicinal cannabis bill as the most progressive legislation of its type ever passed in Parliament. The bill passed its third and final reading this afternoon. Here's our political reporter Craig McCulloch.
The legislation lays the groundwork for a medicinal cannabis industry with regulations to be in place within a year. Until a regime is set up, people who are dying will be allowed to use the drug without fear of prosecution. The National Party says the law is decriminalisation by stealth, but the Health Minister, David Clark, says it's compassionate and caring legislation. He says officials will seek feedback on the scheme next year and will develop quality standards alongside experts. From Parliament, Craig McCulloch.
The Independent Police Conduct Authority has criticised a detective sergeant who lied to the Teachers' Disciplinary Tribunal in order to protect a school. The authority says the officer failed to manage a conflict of interest during a 2014 investigation into a teacher at Gisborne Intermediate, where he was the board chairperson. Warren Young from the authority says 2 years later the man supported the teacher's bid for name suppression after a disciplinary tribunal struck him from the teacher register.
He did so using as support the fact that the investigation was ongoing when he knew that it was not ongoing and had been concluded. He therefore not only presented himself as a police officer and had a conflict of interest in doing so, but he misled the council.
Warren Young says the man's actions amounted to serious misconduct. The European Union has added an unscheduled session about Brexit to a summit due to be held this week. It comes after the British Prime Minister Theresa May postponed a key parliamentary vote on the Brexit deal, which she seemed certain to lose. EU officials are warning the deal itself cannot be renegotiated. Mrs May will meet European leaders tomorrow to discuss a way forward. Here's the BBC's Laura Kunsberg.
She's going off to see her counterparts in Europe, in Holland, and then in Germany tomorrow. We expect maybe in Brussels too in the next 24 hours. There's no sense from her that she's looking for something radically different. The reason for that's clear. She's been at this for more than 2 years. She doesn't think that it's time or the moment to look for something different. But if she isn't on course to get something very different, it's hard to see how she's really going to get different numbers in the House of Commons.
Laura Koonsberg in London. A members' bill making second language learning compulsory in primary schools has drawn cross-party support. The bill, put forward by National MP Nikki Kaye, would see schools teach a language from a list of 10 priority languages, which have yet to be decided on. Labour, Greens and ACT all support the bill to go to Select Committee, but New Zealand First say there is already too much pressure on teachers. Ms Kaye says globalisation is making second language learning increasingly important. She says the bill may be phased into the build of the workforce of language teachers. The bill will have its first reading early next year. A new case of highly infectious measles has been notified in Auckland. The infected person arrived from Manila on Philippines airline flight PR218 on Friday, November the 30th at 2:05 in the afternoon. Auckland Regional Public Health is contacting other passengers seated between rows 44 and 66 closest to the person. It says symptoms may begin to appear in other passengers in the next few days. Anyone seated in those rows who hasn't had the measles vaccination should get one. Others who may feel unwell should phone their doctor or call Healthline on 0800 611 116. A spate of pedestrians hit by vehicles in central Wellington has prompted the police to release a warning. One involved a bus on Manor Street yesterday afternoon. Senior Sergeant Dean Gorry says some have resulted in life-changing injuries, and he's urging pedestrians to put their phone away, pay attention to their surroundings and be patient. He says there is a legal obligation for people to cross at controlled pedestrian crossings if they're within 20 metres of one. It's 6:05. To sport, the New Zealand tennis player Marina Irakovic says she knew it was time to retire when her desire to play at the top level didn't return after a long break from the game. The former world number 39 announced today she has finished with professional tennis after more than a decade as New Zealand's top-ranked singles player. The 30-year-old hasn't played for over a year as she recovered from a back injury and says during that time she realised it was time to put her racket away.
The whole toll of the last few years have just built up, and I know what it takes to get back. And when your motivation and your determination is not great, you know it's time. That sort of made it pretty clear. And also I switched off from tennis and I didn't really follow it a lot. I just did normal things and, I was a happier person.
Marina Irakovic. The Warriors won't consider a makeshift halves partner for Blake Green, leaving two 19-year-olds leading the race to succeed Shaun Johnson. Coach Stephen Kearney hasn't ruled out recruiting a replacement for Johnson, but his priority is to mould a club junior into a first-grade ready playmaker. All eyes are now on the Warriors juniors Chanel Harris-Tavita and Hayes Perham, while former Penrith reserve grader Adam Kieran could also be in from a promotion. Steven Adams scored 22 points to help the Oklahoma City Thunder to a 122-113 win over the Utah Jazz in the NBA basketball competition. The win moves the Thunder to top of the Western Conference standings. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Nick Bollinger samples the science fiction folk of Jane Weaver. We have a window on the world of a radio station based in a psychiatric hospital in Argentina, run by the patients, of course. And this week's after-dinner speaker, our mathematician Dylan Mayhew, explains the lonely runner conjecture, although it's actually about more than one of them. On Nights with me, Brian Crump, from after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Auckland and Coromandel, cloudy periods with isolated showers. Waikato South to Manawatu and Hawke's Bay, including Bay of Plenty and Gisborne, cloudy periods with isolated showers. More widespread and heavy inland during the afternoons and evenings with hail and possible thunderstorms. Horowhenua to Wellington, also Wairarapa, cloudy periods, a few showers mainly tomorrow morning. Marlborough, Nelson, Buller and Westland, mostly cloudy with scattered showers, some heavy inland and with thunderstorms possible in the afternoons and evenings. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, cloudy with occasional rain becoming confined to Canterbury and North Otago tomorrow afternoon, and fine spells developing elsewhere. Fiordland, occasional rain today, fine tomorrow, apart from isolated afternoon showers, and for the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods. It's 6:08, and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thanks, Katrina, and I'm Lisa Owen. The Deputy CEO of the Ministry of Social Development says he'll apologise to a seriously ill man who was at times forced to live in his car. The Ministry did not regard his situation as an emergency and demanded he pay back about $10,000 for emergency motel accommodation. The Social Security Appeal Authority has found that leaving a man with a potentially fatal condition to live in a car was incompatible with his human dignity, and the man, who was in no way to blame for his homelessness, could not afford to pay the debt back. With the help of Auckland Action Against Poverty, the man appealed MSD's decision to claw back the cost of putting him up in a motel and won. AAAP now wants the Ministry to proactively review any similar cases and wipe those debts too. MSD says its policy around emergency accommodation grants has changed since this case, and most no longer have to be repaid. I spoke to MSD's Deputy CEO, Viv Rickard, and asked how he would describe the way this man was treated.
Not too good, really. It's pretty clear. I've had a look at it, and looking at how we do things today and looking at how he was treated back then, it was pretty clear we probably could have dealt with it better in terms of looking after him and ensuring that there wasn't a debt. So I'm not trying to hide from that. As soon as I read the circumstances, I thought this is not how we want to be. So I'm not trying to defend anything in respect of what's occurred.
Not too good. That seems to be a bit of an understatement.
Oh, it's... I can understand at the time that people, we had different rules, different approaches, different policies and how we dealt with these things back then. The people dealing with it dealt with it under the rules they had at the time. I think there was a little bit more discretion. We changed things in July 2016 in terms of, allowing people to get support without having to pay things back. So that's the case in terms of our special needs grants in relation to emergency housing. So how we deal with things today is a lot different. We most of our grants we give for special needs today for housing aren't recoverable, but back then they were slightly different.
All right, I'll get to the changes a bit later, but if we can just address this case for the moment. This was a man who was using a wheelchair, had a potentially life-threatening condition and was forced to live in his car, yet your people did not regard this as an emergency situation. How could that possibly be?
Yeah, well, as I understand it, he used the wheelchair, he had thrombosis, he was living in a car. I'm not trying to defend the fact that he should have been treated better. He should have been treated better. I think the main issue is we try to get him into accommodation, which we did, but we made that recoverable. Today we wouldn't.
There are a couple of issues here. Your staff did not regard it as an emergency situation. So what is an emergency situation if that one wasn't?
Yeah, I think this is one of the things they talked about when they went through the review, that the emergency, we took it in relation to some previous guidelines that had been provided. I think later on, when they looked at this matter, they thought it wouldn't be classed as an emergency. For me, it's an emergency. Actually, someone hasn't got a home to live in. They're sleeping in a car. That's why we established what we've got now.
But what does that tell you about the culture of your department? Because some people would say that just shows you're out of touch if you cannot recognise that situation as being dire. Yeah, look,
obviously there's a whole range of other circumstances, but I'm not trying to defend the fact that we could have done things differently and better. I accept that. The people involved were trying to follow the policies and guidelines at the time. Far be it for me to be critical of individuals. I wasn't even in the organisation at the time. But in when I look at it clearly today, I think we could have done better. It's pretty clear in my mind. I think we did find him accommodation, but we made that accommodation recoverable, and that's the big issue in terms of the debate, whether that accommodation should have been recoverable, i.e. incurred a debt on him. Now, there are times when we do ask for it to be recoverable. We put people into emergency housing and sometimes they trash the place. They've come from a place where they've been kicked out because of their own behaviour. So there are those sort of situations, but this wasn't the case.
No, this wasn't the situation, and the issue of recoverable debt is one thing, but the way this man was treated was another. This ruling says leaving the man to live in his car in these circumstances was incompatible with his human dignity. Depriving an ill person of shelter in temperate climate is incompatible with the values of New Zealand society, and there was a real risk to his life. Can you imagine how hideous that must have been for him?
Oh, of course it was hideous. You know, I've been very clear that I'm not defending what occurred.
Have you apologised to him?
Yeah, look, I went to try and make contact with our staff. Have been trying to make contact. We're going to make sure we write.
When did you start attempting to make contact with him?
From my perspective, I only got briefed fully on it today.
So after I started to make calls, that's when you've tried to make contact with him?
I didn't make contact yesterday. So let me just tell you that. So I've got my people. So,
Mr. Rickard, I'm sorry, but this is important. You have started to make attempts to contact him to apologise after I have raised this issue with you. Is that correct?
The issue is once it went through the authority and they made their findings, it's pretty clear to me when you look at their findings, as I read them today, that actually we were wrong. So I'm always in the position where we're wrong.
After Checkpoint has drawn this to your attention, you're seeking to apologise to him.
I wouldn't take all credit for that, Lisa. I wouldn't say it's all Checkpoint. I think the reality is we're wrong in terms of the decision. I'm pretty clear that when I see these types of things, as soon as I saw it, I knew it wasn't the right thing. I could smell it from a mile away. It wasn't the right thing to do for an organisation. My approach is if we're wrong, I'll say so. If we're right, I will try and defend it.
OK, so your department gave him patchy assistance, which included emergency accommodation eventually in a motel at the cost of around $10,000. As you say, MSD was asking him to pay back that money, and the authority found that any suggestion this man could afford to pay back that money had no connection with reality, and it's ruled that that debt should be wiped. How many other cases do you think there are where you've made poor decisions like this and the debt that has been accrued as a result should be wiped as well?
Well, there's a few things, a few questions in there. Firstly, he came in to get accommodation. We gave him accommodation, so we supported him in that. The difference is we made that recoverable, so he has to pay that back. That was normal at the time. Number two, in relation to other cases, as I understand it as of today, I've asked the same question. I only know of one other that's been reported to me in terms of a similar issue. Each case will be treated on its merits, and they're all a little bit different, but that's the only one I know of as of today.
So are you going to proactively review cases, or are you waiting for someone to come to you and complain about their circumstances?
The data to go back and proactively do it is just virtually impossible to find the numbers that we need to. We said, I want us to be spending our time trying to look after people in their circumstances today. It's quite difficult for us to find accommodation for people. That's where I want our effort. If people come forward, I'm willing to look at their cases, but as I understand it today, the people that we had way back then in terms of recoverable debt and non-recoverable, that was the rules at the time that we dealt with. This was a particular matter that went through the authority and they made a ruling. I accept their ruling completely.
OK, what's the value of recoverable debt for special needs grants for accommodation on your books at the moment? How much is owed for that?
I don't know the exact number.
OK, so you are relying on people who some would say are struggling to put food on the table and a roof over their heads to have enough spare time to come to you and make either a case to the appeal authority or proactively chase you down to review their cases, rather than you taking responsibility and looking back at the details.
Oh, not at all. I made it very clear that our focus is on trying to deal with the people today. The rules are different from 2016. That's what the focus is, as I understand it. The way that we're dealing with recoverable debt, the numbers have reduced considerably. We 11% last year. This year we're at 4%. So that's the amount of debt that we ask for people to pay back. That's usually because of circumstances where they've been kicked out of their previous conversation and it was because of that reason they are seeking emergency accommodation. That's well within the guidelines. I think that's reasonable in terms of that approach. In terms of other people, if they've got issues in terms of how they were treated in terms of recoverable debt, we will look at those. But the reality is, of today, I only know of one other case.
But you haven't actually reviewed the files?
Oh, look, to review the files, I'll get half of our ministry focused on looking back at what happened pre-2016 and that's not what I'm going to do.
That is the Deputy CEO of the Ministry of Social Development, Viv Rickard. A members' bill making second language learning compulsory in primary schools has been drawn from the ballot, but which languages will be given priority is up for debate. National MP Nikki Kaye has secured the support of Education Minister Chris Hipkins for the first reading of her bill. Language teachers have welcomed a national strategy, but there's concern priority will be given to languages with economic advantage over those spoken in the community. Mediana Johnson reports.
The bill looks likely to make it to select committee, with Labour, Greens and ACT all signalling their support. New Zealand First are the only party that opposes the bill. It said in a statement that it would be irresponsible given the workload pressures teachers are already under. The Education Minister, Chris Hipkins, has made it clear it is only a commitment to the first reading, but he does support students learning a second language.
We're very short of language teachers, particularly around Te Reo Māori and some of the languages we already deliver. So, we've got some work to do there. This is going to have to happen over quite a long period of time. It's not going to be something that can happen overnight. In terms of whether it should be compulsory, I think that there is merit in all kids learning a second language.
The bill would require primary schools to teach one of 10 priority languages that have yet to be decided upon, but which Nikki Kaye has said would include Pacific languages and Te Reo Māori. National's Nikki Kaye says learning a second language is important, both socially and economically.
We know that there are less borders between countries, and the concept that many more young New Zealanders could speak a second language is a very good thing.
As the bill currently stands, school boards would consult with the school community to then decide which of the 10 priority languages it wishes to teach, although this would not prevent the school from offering another language. The chair of Auckland Languages Strategy Committee, Susan Warren, says she is concerned about how a priority list of 10 languages is chosen. She says in Auckland alone, there are 160 languages spoken.
I think if we try to choose only a few languages that will be taught, the pressures of economy will always be the first part of the decision. And so sadly, that will always be the languages of trade and the major international languages before community languages come into the picture.
The president of the New Zealand Association of Language Teachers, Annabelle Sinclair, says already many first languages are not supported by the education system.
So currently we are, in a lot of cases, turning bilingual or even multilingual children into monolingual students, and then wondering why some of those people aren't super engaged with the formal education system.
Nikki Kaye says if the language teaching bill became law, it could be phased in as teachers became available.
Depending on the languages that are chosen, whether they're Pacifica, obviously Te Reo is as of right a language that will be taught. There will be different workforce needs for different languages as well.
The bill will be introduced to Parliament sometime next year. For Checkpoint, ko Mediana Johnson tēnei.
Auckland Council is hoping to reopen an iconic Waitakere walking track this summer after major work is done to protect against the spread of Kodi dieback. Boardwalks are being built and a helicopter is transporting gravel to upgrade Kitikiti Falls near Piha. Today, our reporter Tom Furley and visual journalist Dan Cook went out to take a look.
Hovering over the Waitakere forest canopy, it's not hard to see the damage Kodi dieback has done. Senior Ranger Stu Layton points out a large Kodi he estimates is around 300 years old, one of many standing bare and white.
Now with the tree's completely dead, so the bark's getting no goodness, it'll just, all those branches will rot, fall down and collapse in on itself. That's when you get that, basically once that bark has fallen off, that's when you get that real stark white, just sort of skeleton sticking up.
In an effort to stop the spread of the disease on the dirty shoes of walkers and tourists, much of the Waitakere Ranges has been shut. In April, Auckland Council threw its support behind a rāhui put in place by local iwi Te Kawerau Amaki. $100 million from a targeted rate agreed to by the city's residents is being spent over the next decade to tackle the disease and mitigate its spread. One of the first areas to benefit is the track to Kitikiti Falls, a popular spot for locals and tourists.
You know, there is quite a demand to come here, and we do recognise that there is some risk associated with having a closed track and that level of popularity. So I guess prudently we're trying to do this track before some of the other ones.
That's Senior Ranger Dave Markham, who says he hopes the track can be reopened in the new year. Around 20 staff and contractors, supported by volunteers, are moving over 200 tonnes of aggregate, adding 275 metres of boardwalk and creating over 200 metres of boxed steps.
We don't want soil moving, so that's why we're trying to create what we're calling a dry foot surface. So you can walk up here pretty much all year round, any time of the year, arrive back at the cleaning station and really easily clean your feet.
As Stu Layton says, who also holds the role of Kore Dieback manager, it's about minimising mud and protecting the existing forest.
A lot of the work we're doing is precautionary, like you don't want to be going in 20 years' time, oh, I wish we'd done that actually. So we're trying to I know we're asking people to be patient, but you know we're trying to do stuff to the very best of our ability, using the best science knowledge that we've got. So it takes time to get it right, and that's the most important thing for us, is getting these solutions right to allow people back into the forest in a safe way.
Stu Layton says Te Kawerau Amaki, who have a rāhui over the forest, have been involved in the process and what work is being done.
So they still need to obviously be part of that final audit and final sign-off. But as long as we've met those, you know, like we've achieved what we were hoping to achieve up here, the intention is we'd reopen it. But you know, with the decision from the governing body, we need their support to do it, and we want their support. You know, this is a partnership to try and look after this forest, and that's where we're really keen to be.
The iwi couldn't be reached for comment. However, the Tree Council's Mel's Barton has been working with them. She says the council agreed to create a policy and standards for the ranges alongside Te Kawerau Amaki, which are yet to be finished.
That policy is waiting to be jointly agreed, and there's, you know, some debate about that going on right now. So the iwi are definitely not signed off on that policy yet, because they're not happy with where it's at the moment. So council, they can't go public with that or open any tracks until that strategy is agreed.
Mel's Barton says she's happy with the work being done at Kete Kete, but any future track openings are reliant on an agreement with iwi. In Auckland for Checkpoint, Tom Furley.
New Zealand's top-ranked tennis player for more than 10 years, Marina Irakovic, is looking forward to a change in direction after announcing her retirement from the professional game today. Still just 30, Irakovic was coming toward the end of her recovery after a 13-month injury layoff, but has decided she no longer has the motivation to continue at the top level. The Croatian-born Kiwi reached a career-high ranking of 39 in the world, winning 1 WTA singles title and 8 more in doubles. Sports reporter Clay Wilson caught up with Irakovic in Auckland this morning, where she told him the past few years had been hard as she dealt with a variety of injuries.
Last year was very tough. I had to retire from 3 or 4 matches. I had to cancel about 4 or 5 events, and at the end of last year it was just really hard to play, and I'd go to sleep and lie on my back and my legs would go numb, and yeah, it was just a lot of different issues. You know, the travel and everything was slowly killing me. But at the end of last year I sort of said, look, I need to take a break and see if my body can recover, and I did that. And then it was sort of really June, July, and I started training again and working, and it just wasn't great. And to be honest, even when I was sort of going out to play, the motivation was very low. The whole toll of the last few years have just built up, and I know what it takes to get back. And also I really took the year off and I sort of switched off from tennis, and I didn't really follow it a lot. I just did normal things, and you know, I was a happier person.
You're obviously the lone Kiwi woman on tour for almost, if not your whole career. What were the challenges that came with that?
Yeah, from an early age, you know, even juniors, I was sort of on my own or with my dad and then with a coach. And the positive spin on that is probably I got to make a lot of cool friends from all over the world. You know, I used to get along with the Aussies, with the Brits, with the Americans, with the Serbians, with the Croatians. I was quite, I was quite friendly with everyone. But it was tough, and it was tough actually to connect a little bit, to see the support that I had in this country, which I did have. And it wasn't until my first Olympics in Beijing and London where I got to the Olympic Village and all the Kiwis came out and did the haka for me, and it was quite emotional for me because I didn't realise, you know, I had that connection, which is really special. So yeah, interesting aspects about it.
A lot of professional sport is tough to make it in, but tennis is a really global sport alongside a few others. Can you just describe about that week-to-week grind of trying to foot it with the best players in the world, trying to stay among that company, just how difficult difficult is it in a sport like tennis?
Yeah, it's very difficult because you know, the WTA tour is about 2,500 players, and I think it's approximately 100 countries represented. So it's a big environment and it's a big business. There's a lot of money at stake, so it's highly, highly competitive. So I guess a lot of people don't realize the amount of effort and the amount of skill it takes, you know, especially to even break that top 100 barrier. But saying that, it is possible, and I really hope that we can keep doing it in New Zealand.
That's tennis player Marina Irakovic speaking to Clay Wilson after confirming her retirement from professional tennis. Just a little bit of time to get to your feedback. This is on our earlier story about the Ministry of Social Development being ordered to wipe the debt of a beneficiary, around $10,000 that went to emergency motel accommodation. That is a Social Security Appeal Authority review. This one saying that the decision from the authority must now spark MSD into action to review every single recoverable grant made for emergency housing. Well, no, they're not going to do that. I spoke to Vig Rickard from MSD and he said, no, they don't have the resources for that. This from Kushler, who says, I admire the MSD guy for being so honest, Lisa. He was not on the job at the time it happened. It happened under the previous national government. This one says, beneficiaries also find it difficult when they do owe money because they're not told how the loan is decreasing or when it's paid off. So often they overpay and it is really tough for them to get the money back, that texter said. Another one, will the case manager who handled that case be offered retraining or perhaps a transfer to the mail room? That is all we have got time for on Checkpoint this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your company. We'll be back tomorrow. Have a great evening.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The government has labelled the medicinal cannabis bill the most progressive legislation of its type ever passed in Parliament, but National describes it as decriminalisation by stealth. The Ministry of Social Development, who demanded a seriously ill homeless man pay back $10,000 for his emergency housing, has been ordered to wipe the debt. A new family violence investigation reveals it happens behind closed doors in every neighbourhood. Hundreds of people are preparing to gather in Queenstown tonight to pay respects to the slain British backpacker Grace Millane. A police officer has been found guilty of serious misconduct for trying to suppress the name of a teacher who had an inappropriate relationship with a girl he was teaching. And Auckland Council are hoping to reopen a popular Waitakere walking track this summer after major work is done to protect against the spread